All right, let's jump right into it. We all think we get motivation, right? It's that personal fire, the thing that gets you out of bed to go after your goals. But what happens when you need to motivate not just yourself, but an entire team? Well, it turns out that group motivation is a whole different ballgame. It's not just bigger, the rules are completely different.
You know, if you've ever watched The Last Dance, you might think all you need is a superstar like Michael Jordan. His personal drive was legendary, absolutely off the charts. But the documentary makes one thing painfully clear. One person's motivation, no matter how powerful, doesn't just magically spread to everyone else. The idea that a single star can carry the entire team on their back, yep, that's a myth we really need to bust.
And here's why. Individual motivation and group motivation are basically playing two different sports. Your own drive is about your personal goals, your passions, but group motivation? Whoa. Suddenly you're dealing with social dynamics, team chemistry, and all these invisible forces that can either supercharge the group's energy or just suck the life right out of the room.
So, here's our roadmap. We've talked about the Lone Star myth. Next, we'll expose the motivation killers that can poison a team. Then, we'll dive into an incredible story of leadership against all odds. After that, we'll unpack the psychology of drive and finish up by giving you your leadership toolkit with practical ways to put all this to work.
Okay, first things first. Let's meet the villains of our story. And these aren't just abstract concepts. No, these are actual roles and behaviors that can actively sabotage a team's spirit from the inside out.
Villain number one is social loafing. And this is such a fascinating and kind of frustrating quirk of human psychology. Get this, the bigger the team, the less responsible each individual feels for the final outcome. Why? Because your own contribution starts to feel like a drop in the ocean. It feels diluted, almost invisible. So, without even really thinking about it, you start to pull back a little.
And that leads us to villain number two, the free rider. We've all worked with this person, right? They're the one who kind of hangs back thinking, somebody else will take care of it. My effort isn't really needed here. They're basically counting on one of the more motivated people to step up and carry the load so they can just save their own energy.
And that free rider, they create the most toxic problem of all, the parasite effect. This is the real killer. Because what happens when you, a good, motivated team member, sees someone else slacking off? You start to think, hold on a second, why am I working so hard when they're getting a free ride? Nobody wants to be the sucker, so you pull back too. And just like that, the entire team's motivation spirals right down the drain.
This really brings home just how high the stakes are. Researchers use this incredibly stark analogy from trench warfare. Think about it. For any single soldier, the most rational choice is to keep your head down and protect yourself. But if every single person makes that same rational choice, the battle is lost, and everyone perishes anyway. That is the social dilemma, at the heart of every single team, my own self-interest versus the survival of the group.
So, how do you fight against these natural human tendencies, especially when the stakes are literally life and death? Well, for that, we have to turn to one of the most unbelievable leadership stories of all time, the journey of Sir Ernest Shackleton.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1915, and Shackleton has this incredibly audacious goal, to be the first to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. But just as they're getting close, their ship, the Endurance, gets completely and hopelessly stuck in the sea ice, frozen solid. The mission was over before it even really began.
And then it gets so much worse. The ice doesn't just trap the ship, it slowly crushes it until it sinks beneath the waves. Now, 28 men are stranded on a floating chunk of ice at the bottom of the world. For nearly 2 years, they were totally isolated. Shackleton realized his new mission wasn't exploration, it was getting every single man out of there alive. His true enemy wasn't the cold, it was the despair that could tear his team apart.
So how did he do it? He fought those motivation killers with absolute leadership genius. He kept strict routines, he scheduled banjo concerts to keep spirits up, he treated every man, from the scientists to the deckhands, as equals, so no resentment could build up. He gave them a new shared purpose. They weren't a failed expedition, they were an elite survival unit. And through it all, he was this beacon of calm optimism. He essentially built a system where social loafing and free riding just couldn't survive. What Shackleton did was the art of leadership. But here's the truly amazing part. Everything he did instinctively lines up perfectly with the modern science of motivation. So let's peel back the curtain and look at the psychology that explains why his methods were so powerful. It all comes down to something called self-determination theory, or SDT. The core idea is actually pretty simple. It says that for us to have that high-quality, sustainable motivation, not the cheap kind you get from a bonus or a threat, all of us have three basic psychological needs that just have to be met.
Need number one is autonomy. This is our deep, fundamental desire to feel like we're in the driver's seat of our own lives. We need to feel like we have a say, a choice in what we do. Nobody wants to feel like they're just a pawn on someone else's chessboard.
Need number two is competence. This one's about feeling effective. We need to feel like we're good at what we do, and, just as importantly, that we're getting better. It's that feeling of satisfaction when you tackle a tough challenge and you know your skills have grown. It's all about progress.
And number three is relatedness. This is just our basic human wiring. We need to feel connected to other people, to feel like we belong to a tribe, that people have our back and we have theirs. When Shackleton treated every single man as a valued equal, that was him building relatedness in the harshest environment on Earth. But hold on, doesn't giving people autonomy just lead to chaos? Not if you do it right. This is where the brilliant idea of guardrails comes in. As a leader, your job isn't to micromanage how people do their work. Your job is to set up the guardrails. Here's the mission, here are the goals, and here are the boundaries. And then, inside that framework, you let your team innovate and figure out the best path forward. It's freedom with focus.
Okay, we've seen the problem, we've met the hero, and we've learned the science. Now let's get down to brass tacks and translate all this into a practical toolkit you can start using today.
It all starts with three core attitudes. First, be curious. Genuinely want to know and understand the people on your team. Second, be generous. This means always assuming people have good intentions until you have definitive proof otherwise. Give them the benefit of the doubt. And third, be assertive. This one is so important it deserves its own slot.
So let's be really clear about assertiveness. It is not aggression. It's not about yelling or being a bully. And it is not being passive and just letting problems fester because you're afraid of conflict. It is the healthy, strong middle ground where you can state your point of view and address a problem clearly and respectfully. This is how you stop the parasite effect before it can even get started.
So what does this look like day to day? Here are some simple but powerful actions. Validate your team's emotions. Acknowledge how they're feeling. That builds relatedness. Constantly remind people how their unique contribution is essential to the mission. That builds competence. Involve your team in decisions. That's autonomy. And please, ditch controlling language like, I want this by tomorrow, and instead always explain the why. You see how every single one of these tips feeds those three core needs?
And if you're wondering if all this soft skills stuff really pays off, get this. One study of a crisis found that teams that were given the autonomy to innovate and adapt, instead of being forced to follow a rigid process, outperformed their peers by an incredible 200%. 200%! When you trust your people to solve problems, their motivation doesn't just survive a crisis, it skyrockets.
So let's end on this thought. A team's motivation is not a luxury. It's not a nice to have. It is the vessel that will carry you through the absolute worst conditions. It's your endurance. So the real question you have to ask is your ship built strong enough to survive the ice?